no, what is the case?
Read two authors, no two books.
Wonderful. Read two authors, no two books. The first one will be talked by Mr. Amarjeet Sinha. He's going to talk on his book that was released in Amarjeet's book was released by Mr. Amarjeet Sen, part of the Kolkata group. He was telling me in February 2013. And when Amarjeet said that he's launching the book, he said, "Will you come and speak about this book in fact?" So we are having a public lecture today evening at Terry Auditorium, where Amarjeet Sinha will talk about the new book, and we thought we'll take the opportunity for him to also talk to some of our colleagues in the university here, because some of us may not, it may not be convenient for some of us to make it to Terry. Amarjeet very kindly. Amarjeet is a very old and dear friend of ours at Azim Premji Foundation. He's also a member of our research council, and he's not, although he was a member of the research council, correction, and has recused himself from the council recently. And the reason is that he is, as principal secretary of education at Bihar, Azim Premji Foundation and government of Bihar are also forging very close relationships to do work on the ground. I think that's all I would like to say. He's a prolific writer. People who quote and read the Probe report very often remember that Amarjeet is author of that report. Apart from the fact that he did much of the thinking and writing along with the group on Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. I think it was a 5-year stint as director of National Rural Health Mission, and he gave shape to probably one of the most important initiatives in the country on health. I haven't done that introduction well, and I've hardly done any justice to Amarjeet. But Amarjeet, being a friend, you will excuse me and take it. Once again, very warm welcome. Amarjeet will speak for about half an hour, and I guess after that, Atul will speak, and I'm sure Bhupender will do a much better introduction of after that, we can have a question and answer.
Thank you, Giri, for that introduction. And thank you, Azim University, for this opportunity to be here again. I remember I was here some months back talking about a few issues with regard to public systems. I was hoping that Atul will agree to be the first speaker, but I think they have made up their minds both alphabetically and otherwise that AM comes before AD. So I had no option 12. Friends, the next 30 minutes very quickly, I'd like to share with you why this book was written and what is it that it talks about. The name of the book is An India for Everyone, A Path to Inclusive Development. This was written after I had completed my stint with the health ministry in central government. I had about 3 months leave, where Dr. Srinath Reddy at the Public Health Foundation of India was very generous in offering a small little cubicle to work from and to write what I had wanted to write. Friends, the initial impetus came primarily because the time in India that the case is being made for higher investments in education, health and other sectors at a time when perhaps more resources are available to the sector than before. Unfortunately, it is not accompanied by as serious and evidence-based a discussion on how do you make that public system deliver better services. How do you recraft the public system to deliver better services? It was written in the context of an India post-1991. I consider it significant because unfortunately what has happened is post-1991, as a nation, there are a large number, especially among the middle classes, among more prominent in the media or otherwise, people who form public opinion, whose perceptions have almost reached a stage where they feel that post 1991, India could register higher rates of economic growth because of opening up, because of deregulation, because of delicensing, because of a private sector-led economic growth process. Completely agree that yes, post 1991 rates of growth have been significant. Agree that opening up had to contribute to this whole process. Fundamentally, human development or social development is different from economic growth. The unfortunate bit is that a lot of the time is now being wasted in trying to see what alternatives to public system are available even for human development. And this is what is being used. It worries me across the globe. While there can be partnerships with the non-governmental sector, but the core task of provision of services have to come from public systems. This is the evidence of Europe. This is the evidence of East Asia. This is the evidence across the world. I was worried because a lot of our discussions often, especially in the health sector, and perhaps in the health sector, the case for public expenditure and public institutions is much more given the information asymmetry in that sector. Where as a patient, I do not know what giri as my doctor is going to charge me. Whether 5 rupees or 5 lakh, he knows, I don't know. And sectors which have high information asymmetry have a propensity for market failures. Markets don't work. It was in this context that a lot of the thinking into the book, and I recall when the book was being released, and just before that, in all the sessions when Professor Amarjeet had spoken at length about why India needs to do much more on human development, on education, on health, and women's rights. During that session, I made the mistake of asking him a question, and that question was that yes, fully share what you said, that India needs to put in much more resources. But I just shared my apprehension that unfortunately, good evidence-based research on public systems, on how they can deliver better services. For example, if you are looking at a program like say the Mahila Samakya, just as one example, how has it done in the States? Purely on an empirical basis, in terms of what it through a research, a rigorous research methodology to see how the program did, you will find very few studies. We all know that Tamil Nadu has done well on public health, but when you start looking for good evidence-based studies, very, very few are available. So the point I made to Professor Sen was that universities in India need to spend a little more time on studying public systems and providing good evidence-based studies on the same. To which his retort was that Amarjeet now wants academics to do administration as well. But that is not the issue. The book and the background to the writing of the book, essentially I was trying to make a case on the basis of the experiences of the last about 20-25 years working in India in these sectors, on how, what is it that can contribute towards a possible, credible public system. We all have our own complaints and grievances about the public system. But given the fact that one, there can be no inclusive development without human development. I think that's the first point that the book makes. That you can have financial inclusion, you can have social inclusion, you can have many things else. But fundamentally, if you do not address human development issues, it can never be an inclusive society. If you do not provide the opportunity for every individual to be able to develop their fullest human potential. The accidents of birth should not determine the trajectories of our life. And if that's going to happen, it has necessarily to happen through social and human development. It was in this context that I started looking at some of the key principles which inform public systems. Why do they fail, or why do they not succeed in the manner that we would like them to? In doing so, the book first looks at a few sectors like say the conduct of elections in India. How come that same public system is able to conduct elections reasonably fairly and is an example for a large number of emerging democracies? What is it about the conduct of elections which is different from the other ways of managing public systems? So it was in this context that the book looked at issues of public recruitment, looked at issues of public management skills. For example, a large number of graduates from institutions like the Azim Premji University, like the IHMR, like the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, young professionals who can contribute very meaningfully and significantly to what happens in education and health. How does one create the space for such professionals to be part of public systems? Because ultimately, programs which have worked and which have worked well, Mahila Samakhya is one very good example, which again focused a lot on getting good professionals into the system who had a certain commitment to certain perspectives on gender and development. Now, what this book has tried to do is based on the global and the national evidence. Again, very strangely, these things don't get written about enough, but when you start analyzing the human development reports published every year by the UNDP, I started doing an analysis of the sum of the erstwhile Soviet bloc countries. And what you discover in that process is that many of them, their levels of human development are far higher than what their rates of economic growth would have entailed, or what their per capita incomes would have entailed. One example is Vietnam's HDI ranking being better than India, though its per capita incomes are lower than India's. Now, I think these kinds of studies ought to be undertaken simply to understand the key role of public systems in sectors like education and health. Having said that, the book goes on to explore a lot of the issues with regard to partnerships. What is it that works? What is it that doesn't work? And again, partnerships, because if you look at, say, the education sector, and I was very pleasantly surprised to find this little publication of the Azim Premji Foundation, where they have looked at just 3 issues in elementary education based on the evidence that they have gathered. One on what makes a school successful, the status of diets and pupil-teacher ratios, why they should be 30. It's refreshing to find these being set on the basis of evidence, on the basis of studies. Normally we have been taking ideological position on this. And partnerships become important because when you look at education, a whole lot of studies which have come out of education ever since the Unikrishnan judgment, the right to education, the constitutional amendment, the RTE 2009. I remember as a member of the probe team, we did a visit to some of the more difficult states in 1996. We visited about 200 odd schools in 96. The probe team revisited these schools in 2006, and we came out with a probe revisited. And the probe revisited, what it pointed out was the number of schools gone up significantly, number of teachers gone up significantly, number of classrooms went up very significantly. But within the classroom and classroom processes, no change at all. Now, this start finding in study after study, how come teacher education got left out? How come teacher education institutions and their reform did not find as much favor in the states as they ought to have? Now, these are fundamental issues about crafting credible public systems. Today, every ASAR report and its condemnation rightly of the failure of the public system in providing quality education. The answer to it lay in an evidence-based understanding of what is it that is holding back transformation of classroom processes. What my book has tried to do is to look at some of these experiences in India and outside the country, to look at what has worked and what has not worked, to come to some inferences as to what is it that we need to do, given the fact that going away from public systems is not an option. We've had very senior people in government at positions of eminence often talk about conditional cash transfers, as if this is now going to be the solution of all problems. What a misreading of Brazil and Mexico it is. You have to realize it to understand where it is coming from. Brazil went in for universal primary education as an entitlement, and universal primary health as an entitlement. What we forget, it coveted a good 8% public expenditure GDP on health, and more than 4% on education. After honoring the financial commitments made therein to be able to enforce, again, Brazil also is a large nation. It's a federal nation with provincial governments and local governments. But when they went in for a legislation for universal primary education and universal primary health, each and every level of government knew its financial commitments for the next 20 years. What is it that they need to provide? Our Right to Education Act 2009 very conveniently said it is a joint responsibility of the central and the state government. A shared responsibility. It did not define in actual terms what the financial resources ought to be to back the amendment to the Constitution and the Right to Education Act. Friends, I am stating the example of Brazil and Mexico simply because Bolsa Familia caught the imagination of everybody. Conditional cash transfers is the answer to all our problems. Not realizing that in Brazil and Mexico, cash transfers were attempted after provision of services. Provision of health and education services was first guaranteed before they went in for a conditional cash transfer for the poorest households. It's important to understand this because cash transfers is no substitute for provision of services. You will need services. It is like the Janani Suraksha Yojana, which is also a form of cash transfer, conditional cash transfer for institutional delivery. But as we have seen in so many states, our facilities, public facilities were not prepared to take the increased load for institutional deliveries. We introduced a cash transfer scheme. While more women have come to the facilities, what has also come as evidence from studies that many of them did not have the quality of institutional delivery that they ought to have for it to be a safe delivery, for it to be appropriate and proper delivery. So mere cash transfer is no substitute for quality of services. Similarly, an area which the book looks at quite closely is the whole thing about accreditation and assessment. Education and in the health sector. Unfortunately, many of the debates are always ideological. I wish they were more evidence-based. And that's why I keep making the plea for evidence-based studies. While ideology informs all walks of social science, I have no contest with that. But an ideology must also be backed by good evidence. I raise the issue of assessments and accreditation because I personally do believe that in the process of making public systems more accountable, we cannot go away from assessments and accreditation. We simply cannot go on putting monies into public systems that do not deliver. We simply cannot go on putting money into systems where no outcomes are assessed. End of the day, whichever the system, whether it's public or private, it will have to lend itself to an assessment of which way it is going. Friends, likewise, a lot of the ideological discussions, even today's Times of India, those of you who would have seen George Matthews' very emotional plea about Panchayati Raj. I am all for local governments. I am all for Panchayati Raj institutions. But do we not need to look at the evidence on how NREGA in many of the states has been a source of boleros for Panchayati Raj institution elected representatives? Why did it happen? Have you tried to look into it? Your block development offices in many states had collapsed over the last so many decades. We want to implement NREGA through the same Walkington block development office just by saying at 2% of the administrative cost, please get more professionals. That is not going to do it. Unless and until you worked out your detailed last mile planning for professionals and others to manage the system, how will you ever get the results? Likewise, you see the important thing to understand is it's not that public systems cannot deliver, but even on Panchayati Raj, all said and done, the Constitution of India mandated the executive, the legislature and the judiciary. And the three of them were kept separate. Separate in the sense that there should not be overlapping jurisdictions. An elected Panchayat representative, let us bear in mind, is an elected representative whose of the local government as far as policy making is concerned. But if we were to create a monopoly of executive function at that level, that can be quite dangerous. And therefore, the plea which has often been made that you need community organizations at that level to work with PRI, not outside the framework of PRI. Nobody is questioning George Matthew or anybody else's need for decentralization and local governments as the key institutions and agencies for implementation of programs at the local level. I am not at all questioning the constitutional framework within which decentralization has to take place. The evidence suggests that you need to create a dialogue at that level between community organizations. It may well be women's self-help groups, it may well be Mahila Samakya groups, may well be many other community organizations at the habitation level who have a direct stake in a lot of what happens. They have a direct stake because, again, something that we've seen to bypass evidence. 60% of India's so-called revenue villages are less than 1,000 population. A Gram Panchayat ideally ought to have a 5,000 population. States like Bihar, a Gram Panchayat is catering to 14 to 15,000 people because they have not created as many new Gram Panchayats based on population. So what is happening? In effect, a Gram Panchayat is covering anywhere between 10 to 18 habitations. This is the case in West Bengal, this is the case in Odisha, this is the case in Chhattisgarh, this is the case in Madhya Pradesh. Unless and until Jharkhand, Bihar, they are not the villages of Kerala where 20,000 people are living in a village. They are not like the clustered villages of Tamil Nadu where 15,000 people are living in one village. The PRI arrangements perhaps can work much better if that is the clustered existence which people are in. But wherever very small habitations and a large number of them constitute a Gram Panchayat, the leadership of the Gram Panchayat need not necessarily represent the well-being of each and every habitation of that area. It's an important issue to bear in mind. In spite of reservations, in spite of reservations for women, this fact of life that PRI elected representatives need to engage with community organizations, and two, that we need to move away from creating monopolies of executive functions as contractors of public works. The model we have really promoted is a contractor of public works from an elected representative. So rather than going into these questions in our country, we specialize in what I refer to is bipolar analysis of issues. X is good, Y is bad. A is good, B is bad. One is not questioning decentralization at all, but for it to be more meaningful, it needed to learn from other programs which have used habitation as a unit and work well. Mahila Samakya is a very good example, where you created collectives of women at the village level, the Mahila Sangha, the first level at which it formed, and thereafter you created your other bodies. It's a very good example that a lot of the empowerment doesn't happen by itself. There are processes that have to be gone through. It's a highly process-intensive program. We have the example of the Velugu project in Andhra Pradesh, which again has done well in many of the Gram Panchayats. While the linkages with the Panchayat are weak, again the program has a large number of professionals at various levels. And results have shown wherever these professionals have been engaged meaningfully in that whole process. My only plea is that if we had gone in for an evidence-based analysis and assessment of what is happening, rather than always indulge only in ideological debates, any amount of pouring in money into the public system will not deliver services. So I think I see a very major role, and in this book one has argued the case quite strongly, that one, India needs to work on its public systems more effectively. It needs to put in more financial resources into education, health and other sectors. There cannot be inclusive development without fully bringing on board education, health and nutrition sectors. Now one whole chapter in this book is on nutrition. I personally feel that it's a very important chapter simply because while the Prime Minister of the country and the National Platform 15th August address all always calls it a national shame that undernutrition is so high. But then try and see what are we trying to do to resolve it. We don't seem willing even to get rid of this wrong notion that nutrition lends itself to narrow departmentalism. We are looking for all the results of nutrition from the ICPS program. So unfair to the ICPS program. Nutrition doesn't lend itself to narrow departmentalism. Health, education, water, sanitation, all of them have to come together for there to be results. If it's a national shame, is it not a bigger shame that we don't have anybody in districts who understand nutrition professionally? Why don't we have nutrition professionals in districts or in blocks? I think measurements, what came out in the Hangama study which came out recently. If nutrition is such a big problem, why is measurement of nutrition not happening? What is holding it back? I raise these issues because the solutions are no rocket science. On nutrition in particular, I can say with confidence, there are n number of global examples. China, again, we like to be compared with large countries. I have made comparisons in my book about Brazil, China and other countries. A lot of what China did between 49 to 79 and which significantly brought down morbidity and mortality was something very basic, very, very basic. Assured clean water, assured food security, basic primary health functions of immunization and others, a few public health measures, and fifth, to manage the whole system of a system of barefoot doctors. The barefoot doctor was bare in no manner. Essentially what China had done, they too like India had a large number of quacks. What China did was either you do a 18-month program to become a barefoot doctor or stop practicing medicine. One of the two. So the barefoot doctor was actually somebody who was trained for 18 months. The clean water did not happen only through piped water in every village or something. Even they couldn't afford it at that time. But then China during this period very strongly, it promoted what they called a cultural habit of having green tea. Whichever village you go to, at the community center, you will find the water boiling all the time. Children were encouraged to have only this water and nothing else. One stroke of culture they used to eliminate all waterborne diseases. Do not consume water in any other form, but only in the green tea that you have. Likewise, public health measures, nothing very big. They had a problem of rodent-related health problems, hazards. There was a public health program with a number of tails of a rat that you collected, you were paid for. This was one of the public health campaigns. Immunization. Just by food security, clean water, immunization, public health measures and a barefoot doctor, China halved its malnutrition, undernutrition levels from about 58% to 24-26%. Closer time-wise, 1980 to 1986, Thailand. So what did Thailand do? Thailand had a community worker for every 20 persons. Even today when you go to Thailand, those yellow shirt wearing community workers who will come across, none of them is paid a salary. None of them. But their process of training is very intensive. In Thailand, you can actually go to a night market which is selling goods, all kinds of cheap goods. In the morning when you go there, you will not know that a market was there here last night. It is as clean as can be. The community workers in Thailand. Likewise, in the case of Vietnam, the way they have handled water and sanitation issues, and the spin-off water and sanitation on undernutrition. So, fundamentally, what comes out that in many of these sectors, nutrition in particular, narrow departmentalism is not the answer. You need what is referred to often as a wider human development approach. Again, a point which the book makes very strongly that the time has come for us in India to adopt a human development approach to our efforts at inclusive development in education, health, water, sanitation and nutrition. In fact, I am happy to inform this house that in Bihar, that I went back about 3 years ago, one of the new initiatives of the government is to to set up a Mission Manav Vikas, a cabinet committee on human development, where essentially the Chief Minister and 16 ministers every quarter have decided to review 16 or 18 indicators from water, sanitation, health, nutrition and education to see whether we are moving in the right direction. There are monitorable targets there. In case central and state government programs do not cover the priority areas, new programs can be initiated. But essentially the argument is that these sectors don't lend themselves to narrow departmentalism. If a child doesn't learn in school, it may well be because of an irreversible damage to the learning process on account of undernutrition in the 6 to 36 month period. Enough medical evidence to say that this is actually true. It may well be because of governance deficits. It may well be because of teacher development deficits. Now, governance deficits of public systems cannot be on the back burner all the time. Governance, good governance of Sushasana does not come in bits and pieces. I cannot have a system where as a secretary I give in to every transfer of teacher or every transfer of the education officers, where money exchanges hands and transfers and postings, and then to expect that these institutions will deliver results. It doesn't happen like that. The challenge therefore for public systems is to realize that governance reforms have to be the priority. If you want to craft public systems differently, RTI is an instrument to tell us what went wrong. We also need arrangements for us to be able to think through what is required. I gave the example of Narega and the mock-eaten block office. In many states, it was designed to fail because we did not create any instruments or arrangements to be able to implement the program effectively. Friends, I am reaching the end of my time and only say that what this book has attempted, most in all humility and in all modesty, I would only like to say that it has tried to see what may work, what has worked, and what needs to be done for India to be truly inclusive, for Indian society to be truly inclusive, for India to be able to address a lot of gender inequalities, undernutrition, and other deficits more effectively. I raise the issue of gender and social inequalities because each time when somebody points out to us that Bangladesh is doing better than us, we often forget that these are the reasons, unless and until, while a lot of the gap has been bridged, there is a long way to go on many of these matters. While West Bengal compares very well with Bangladesh, India compares unsatisfactorily with Bangladesh. The answer lies there. How come Bengal, with all its limited interventions, with all its, what is there about the society in Bengal which makes a difference? We need to understand. After Tamil Nadu and Kerala, why is it always the third state on indicators in a positive sense, especially with regard to health indicators and mental health indicators? Friends, what the book makes a case for is that it is no rocket science to ensure human development for all. It makes the point that good human development is also good economics. Only if people have better skills, more knowledge, higher order knowledge society, then alone will they have surpluses with them which may be needed to sustain higher rates of economic growth to greater demand for goods and services. So somewhere or the other, the cycle of better human development contributing towards economic growth, but I see them as intrinsic rights of a citizen. It is not only because it's good for economic growth, but much more as an intrinsic right of a citizen to develop her or his fullest human potential. Thank you.
It's difficult to introduce a friend because apart from being a good teacher, a very popular one, Sashwati remembers him as a teacher in JNU. I just have to say 2 or 3 things. One is, I guess, one is very privileged to be born in the middle class in a country like ours, and yet we noticed that very few amongst us have spine. Here is a guy I can vouchsafe. I've seen him seen his beard absolutely black. It's gone all grey now. The guy has a lot of cement in his spine. Privately, I can tell you, he's the one guy. He's the reason why we are still not in a place called the Center for Research in Rural and Industrial Development, where we had made a beehive for ourselves and we were doing quite fine. The guy fell out with the queen bee there, a guy called Rashpan. And the beehive just got lost. So he has a lot of spine, and he is under pressure. As of today, he is under pressure by none other than people in the central government. He has something to say about Gujarat. Why should the Congress government and people running it in there should be putting pressure on him that you don't go and talk about Gujarat? It's a done story. You know, what is it that new that you are telling people and so on and so forth? You know, I requested him nevertheless, and Giri, etc. agreed that you come and talk about the book that you have done. No matter what pressure comes on you, we handle it together. The book essentially, for those who know that economic growth is not enough, the nice joke that you may carry home is that before Lula came into Brazil, there was this Brazilian president visiting the US, and on the airport he was asked, how's Brazil? How's Brazil? He said, Brazil is doing fine, the people are not. So Gujarat's been doing very fine. Why Gujarat's not been, why Gujarati has not been, Gujaratis have not been so fine, is what we expect Atul to tell us.
I'm here in front of you because of him. I'm very grateful to Azim Premji University for giving me the chance to come here and speak about the work. At the outset, I must say that this is a book which is an edited book. It's been done by 10 students of mine and myself. So essentially it's a work done by students who look at issues of development and issues of regional development. It's a work which is based essentially on secondary data. So I don't have any roadside story about Gujarat. It's based on a very, if I may say so, very rigorous and very careful analysis of secondary data, to the extent that I've only received 55 gate bills so far, which means my data work was fairly rigorous, because I should have received 550 or 5,550 by now. So essentially the work is very carefully done on looking at the experience of Gujarat. It's not on the much sort of controversial Chief Minister of Gujarat in many ways. It's a work which looks at systematically what Gujarat has done in the last 15 or 20 odd years, carefully using data on a range of sectors and indicators, starting from infrastructure, investment, education, health, agriculture, industry, and so on and so forth. It looks at every sector. And in fact, the choice of sector is based on a set of my students who work in each of these areas, looking at issues of research in either investment or employment and so on and so forth. And this time for us together, they have looked at from the vantage point of a particular state. Let me also say at the outset a couple of things. First, this is a biased account of the trajectory of development in Gujarat. Biased in the sense that it's not ad hoc, but biased in the sense that it has a lens to look at the experience of development in Gujarat. And the lens is a very simple one. The simple lens is that we don't want to look at averages, we want to look at social gaps. So the exercise is to look at gap between men and women, between Dalits and non-Dalits, between tribals and Dalits, between tribals and non-tribals, and so on. Why it is not ad hoc is that we have applied that principle to explore the impact of development across all states. So if I compare Gujarat with Tamil Nadu, I apply the same parameter. If I apply, this criteria in the context of Gujarat, I also apply to Maharashtra or to Haryana also. So basically what we have done is used certain sort of simple tools to look at the experience of development in Gujarat. social development in India, it really helps me to focus more on and to spend more time on looking at the sort of drivers of growth in Gujarat. And then later on, I will connect the drivers of growth in Gujarat with the kind of outcomes that Amarjeet was referring to. So, in a sense, what I do is to link up the strategy with outcomes. And in fact, I think that the conversation on governance in Gujarat should be located in this discourse on linking strategy and outcomes. What happens is, whether we talk about A groups or B groups, either people are just focus on strategy or look on outcomes. But what is the need is, and we feel the need is, to construct a narrative linking up the strategy with outcomes. And it is in this sense that we have a lens, in this sense we have a perspective of how we collaborate a story linking up the strategy with outcomes in the context of Gujarat. And the narrative that we use, or the lens we use, is a very standard one, which is to look at and try and attempt to do a political economy analysis of the experience of development in Gujarat. And political economy in simple sense means looking at the role of ideologies, the role of institutions, and role of interests in constructing the dynamics of development in a particular region or a space. So we are interested in looking at, when we do the attribution and say, well, this outcome perhaps could be linked with that strategy, we are looking at either one of these or all of these, that is the ideology, institutions, and interests. So it's a very simple exercise, and for an informed audience like this, which is sitting here, it perhaps might be just helpful that you might just get more details about what has happened in Gujarat. You already know the connect between the strategy and outcome. Since it's a very informed audience, so it just might be that we have spent a little more time, a few more hours than you, looking at numbers and telling our story of what is happening in Gujarat. I'm afraid we might not go from this hall with much new insights about Gujarat once I finish my conversation with you. One more comment before I come to Gujarat, that as we see Gujarat's trajectory of development, it is nothing but an effective, some people want to call it efficient, I don't want to use that word, but more effective implementation of the trajectory of development that the Indian state has chosen for itself. So really there is no sort of great contradiction between the trajectory or direction of development between Gujarat and the rest of India. Except that what Gujarat has done is that it has achieved on some parameters, on strictly underlying some parameters, a relatively more than what probably the national average may have achieved. So in a sense, there is no Gujarat stamp on this trajectory of development. In fact, there is, if I may to say so, there is nothing unique in this strategy with Gujarat. This strategy of development is very well aware of what the strategy entails. It's a strategy which is led by the corporates. It's a strategy which is for the rich. It's a strategy with the losers or the poor. As I said, that's no new insight for you. Perhaps the new insight will be as I unfold of how that is happening in Gujarat. My first point about Gujarat is that what Gujarat has built in the last 10 to 15 years is something which has squandered the historical advantage that Gujarat had. Gujarat is not this fast-growing state today. Gujarat was very developed state in the past. So what has Gujarat squandered is this opportunity to construct more inclusive growth. It had this historical lead, historical advantage to construct a relatively more inclusive growth of inclusive development in Gujarat, which I think the last 15 years of development strategy in Gujarat has lost that opportunity. It's a state with a history of cooperatives, the biggest successful cooperative movement in India. It's a state which has a history of Gandhian trade movement. It's a state which has historical role in terms of how the textile industry evolved and the sort of location of textile industry in Gujarat, which has been the most employment generating industry historically in India. So it was a state which, and it was a state which was doing fairly well for all kinds of historical reasons in terms of the growth outcomes. So it was a state which had the opportunity to use this base of relatively developed institutions to construct a more inclusive model of development, whether it's cooperative, whether it's the relationship between capital and labor, or whatever else. But it did not use this benefit of history to construct a better society for itself. The second point that I want to make is what Gujarat, and I will sort of elaborate as I sort of proceed, that there is a glaring failure in the experience of development in Gujarat in providing basic needs and welfare requirements for the poor in the state. So the large majority of people, the state has not provided basic needs and welfare. In fact, there is a slippage, there is a decline in the outcome indicators with the poor and the marginalized. The third point that I want to talk about Gujarat is how the growth performance in Gujarat is linked with how the public exchequer has been used as a driver for private accumulation. So how private accumulation in Gujarat has happened through cross-subsidization, if you were to allow me to use that word, from the public exchequer. And in fact, we need to do a lot more field-based studies in Gujarat because many of this information is not in the public domain and not available in secondary data to further establish this story, but our book clearly gives enough indication how there is this linkage in the use of public exchequer which has strengthened or promoted private accumulation at the cost of state meeting its social obligation. So the social obligation of the state is compromised in order to facilitate private accumulation in the state of Gujarat. And the fourth, which is a minor point, but a point worth highlighting nonetheless, that the story of industrial success in Gujarat and the sustainability of growth in Gujarat is highly exaggerated. In fact, I would sort of, since there's already a great deal of talk about inclusive development, I will establish in some of the points that I elaborate how the growth model of Gujarat itself is not sustainable. And therefore, the euphoria that we have about the success story of Gujarat, and since it's a public article, I can quote him. Dear friends from US have written in Times of India saying by Arvind Managari wrote a piece in Times of India saying that he really regrets sitting there in US while his real state Rajasthan has not adopted Gujarat model of development. And I said, well, thank God Rajasthan has not yet implemented the Gujarat model of development. So there is this great euphoria about the Gujarat model how to be replicated across Indian states. The experience is so positive. And I think that the experience of Gujarat, as I unfold in front of you, is actually very limited. We need to draw appropriate lessons from that experience before we generalize and make any conclusions about Gujarat. So these are some of my opening comments about Gujarat before I come to the nitty-gritties of what has been the experience of development in Gujarat. Now, the failure of success in Gujarat, if I were to say, when we use this term this afternoon, Gujarat in terms of growth has been consistently good performing. If you look at just the aggregate number. And for those of us who are really fond of growth numbers, I can also say so that Gujarat is one good example, quote unquote, where growth is fairly dispersed. In the sense, all the three sectors in Gujarat have fairly done well. Now, usually when we look at growth, we say, well, from agriculture, we have gone to services. We have missed this phase of industrial contribution to growth and so on. So all that discussion about balanced growth, imbalanced growth and so on, and the sustainable growth, it happens if the growth is coming from all quarters and so on and so forth. Growth has come from all quarters and so on. So I don't think you would get a relatively better outcome purely on growth indicators anywhere that is easy. And if these growth indicators of these growth dynamics has given what it has given, then we must sit back and question and re-examine what does this growth mean for all of us, and can we think of other kinds of drivers for growth, other instruments for growth, or can we rethink about the whole dynamics and process of growth itself? I think Gujarat provides a good opportunity to sort of sit back and look at it more carefully. Now, let me take two sectors or two drivers of growth in Gujarat a little more in detail. One is the standards on agriculture, the other is manufacturing. Now, as I said, agriculture growth in Gujarat has performed much better than the national average. The growth in agriculture comes from a shift in favor of commercial crops in Gujarat, essentially cotton, groundnut, and fruits and vegetables. These high-value crops have contributed more to growth in agriculture in Gujarat by declining the shares of food grains in the overall production in Gujarat. This decline in food grain production in Gujarat gets reflected on all the broad three indicators or three parameters of growth, that is in terms of acreage, output and value. So whichever indicator you might pick up, you can see that in relative terms, food grains have declined, and it is these crops that I mentioned, cotton, down, and fruits and vegetables which have performed better. The growth in these crops has happened unsupported by any investment or new investment in irrigation. And that's an interesting story. There is vis-a-vis these crops, I'm not talking about overall, vis-a-vis these crops, that is the drivers of growth of agricultural growth in Gujarat do not come from investments in irrigation, which means these crops have greater dependence on rainfall, which means that there is a great deal of instability in the production of these crops in Gujarat, which gets reflected in the upswings and downswings, and therefore its implications on agricultural income across a size class of farmers who are involved in the production of these crops. The sub-regional story in terms of growth in agriculture is being that the best performing agricultural regions have been Saurashtra and Kutch, and that accounts for majority of these non-food crops. Groundnut in particular has documented huge degree of fluctuations in terms of both yield and production. So the instability part is the major source. Now the remarkable agricultural growth in Gujarat, remarkable in course, has taken place in the backdrop of extraordinarily liberalized agricultural land policy regime. Two major changes in terms of legislation in Gujarat agriculture has happened. First is that the restrictions on the purchase of land by non-local within an 8-kilometer radius of villages in Gujarat has changed. This was changed in 1995. I'll not elaborate. This is the amendment to the Bombay Tenancy and Agriculture Land Act of 1956. I'll just talk about two implications of that. One implication is that it has increased the speculation in land and agricultural areas, particularly in the Narmada project land area, because the value to which the speculated, purchase of land by non-farmers has led to the speculation in that bed. And overall in the state of Gujarat, this has led to increased land transfers from agriculture to non-agriculture classes amongst the fast-growing cities in Gujarat. So if you look at the the peripheries of mega cities or big cities in Gujarat, there is a land transfer happening from agriculture classes to non-agriculture classes. The second significant policy input that Gujarat has done is that it has changed its policy with respect to transfer of village commons, and it has allowed the transfer of village commons to private parties. Now, Gujarat is a state which is known for its livestock, milk production, and so on. And in some sense, what it has done is it's privatized its common population. This has implications in terms of the large population which is dependent on livestock and its grazing land. So the livelihood of the landless and small peasant, which was critically linked with livestock and access to pastures, has got altered as a result of this legislative change. It has again implications for security of people, or livelihood security of people involved in this agriculture production. The gains from agriculture are fairly uneven across numerous other considerations in terms of which districts they are impacting, and in terms of different crops and different size class of farmers participating in the production of each of these crops. I'll not go into technical details of how the participation of, just mention one point, the participation of small and marginal farmers in the fast growing crops of Gujarat have declined. So in other words, the beneficiary of the drivers of growth are more in terms of the upper size class farmers rather than the bottom sort of quintile of the size of the farmers. The chapter on agriculture meticulously established. Let me come to the more interesting story of manufacturing and the much hyped story of manufacturing. Gujarat has about 14% of India's organized manufacturing gross value added, just 9% of its employment, 19% of its fixed capital, and 10% of its total factories. Just to give you a sense of where Gujarat stands in relation to India. The share of gross value added in India's total of Gujarat in India's total value added has doubled between 1980s and 2000. the share in fixed capital has trebled. Refined petrochemicals and chemical sectors are the two sectors which account for 60% of the GDP in Gujarat. The refined petroleum and chemical sectors have large import content, very high import content, and needing a well-developed port sector. And I will come to the story later on, how the rise of these subsectors in manufacturing is linked to the privatization of mine and ports in Gujarat, which is the story of success of infrastructure development in Gujarat. This is my larger point of how the public sector or the state really cross-subsidizes the private sector and gives impetus to growth. I'll come back to it when I talk about infrastructure. The concentration in terms of refined petrochemical and chemical industry has implications in terms of environment, in terms of pollution. It has also reduced the linkage with the ancillaries and weakened the linkage between the organized and the unorganized sector. Don't have the time to elaborate. If you look at the traditional industrial sector in Gujarat, particularly after the decline of the textile mills in Gujarat, the industrial growth experience of Gujarat was more about linkage between the organized and the unorganized. And the shift now towards more capital-intensive manufacturing in the last 50 years has meant dilution of this linkage between the organized and the unorganized. And you would know that once this linkage gets broken and unorganized sector gets relatively weak, it has implications in people's income and livelihoods in the other sectors. I'll talk about the labor market characteristics of this high growth in the manufacturing sector. The manufacturing sector in Gujarat has the very low employment elasticity. That means for every unit increase in output, the gain in employment is very marginal. Gujarat has the lowest share of wages in gross value added in India. So the share of wages in the value added, that means the success of manufacturing as it translates to gains to the workers, is the least in Gujarat. The employment generation in manufacturing is stagnant. There is increase in use of contract workers and overall relatively reduced position of workers in the manufacturing sector. I say this in relation to the other fast-growing states. All the chapters in the book compare Gujarat on similar indicators, as I said in the beginning, with fast-growing states of India, which means looking at Maharashtra, looking at Tamil Nadu, looking at Haryana, and so on and so forth. So we look at what has Gujarat achieved in spite of its high growth on each of these indicators in manufacturing compared to other states. Now, the share of women in employment is very low in Gujarat. The extent of casualization is very high. All of this is happening in India. It's just happening with greater intensity in Gujarat. And that's the point. I've just got. So, the rising trend of casualization of workforce is happening in India as well. But it is happening at much faster pace in Gujarat. There is immense amount of spatial concentration of manufacturing industries. 60% of manufacturing is just in 3 districts, Jamnagar, Vadodara, and Sood. That's also to do with the capital-intensive nature of manufacturing in Gujarat. So the recent success of manufacturing growth and the associated hype about governance in Gujarat has done nothing to address the regional, structural, and employment imbalances that the manufacturing sector unleashes in Gujarat. That's the first point you must remember. The implication of the growth model in manufacturing has meant that more greater share of Gujarat's population is dependent on low-paid jobs in the manufacturing sector, and their livelihoods have become more unsustainable or more volatile as a result of this breaking of the linkage between the organized and the unorganized. This manufacturing story is always linked to the discourse with two things. One is this vibrant Gujarat economy, the hype about investment. It's true, investment has come to Gujarat. The numbers say it. Or what is happening in investment, and the other is linked with investment is the story of infrastructure, because part of the investment is coming in infrastructure. So if you want to understand the background of this Gujarat manufacturing model in Gujarat, we need to link it up with the investment and infrastructure model. Then what is probably done. So the buzz of the investment and infrastructure is something which needs our attention. What I did, so for everything I have not used any private sector data. I have either used government of Gujarat data or I have used government of India data. I have not used any of the data that is produced by all now we have these data agencies, Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, all of these. I have used none of this data. I have strictly restricted myself to using only public sources of data so that what it says, it can't be challenged saying, well, it's biased because it's biased for Gujarat, it's biased for Tamil Nadu, it's equally biased for Maharashtra and so on. So the relative position and the relative performance of Gujarat will be valid in terms of looking at this number. When you look at the share of projects implemented in Gujarat from 2003 to 2011, and I fully understand that investment happens with a lag. So I promise X amount of investment, it takes some years for that investment to mature. So you can analyze data based on giving a lag of 2 years, 3 years, whatever you think is your accurate based on your own experience. From 2003 to 2011, if you look at the numbers range from, and I have details I don't remember, in 2003, if 100 projects were promised, 73 were implemented. In 2009, if 100 projects were promised, only 30 were implemented. You can see, and in 2011, of course, which is very recent, so you have to be careful in interpreting that number, the number is just 30. So out of 100, only 30 projects were implemented. Now, it's not that this fatigue of investment has something to do with only Gujarat. There is a fatigue of investment globally. And perhaps that fatigue of investment globally is also getting reflected in Gujarat. Quite possible. I'm not attributing this to failure of X, Y, and Z in Gujarat. But I'm just saying that the hype of investment has to be seen with this declining trend of investment in Gujarat. Now, you all know, where does investment go? It's a race to the bottom. Where you get the best tax concessions, where you get the best land subsidy, where you get lowest wages, and so on and so forth. In other words, where you can be. So from Bengal to Gujarat, the nature of offer was such that you would be the stupidest man in the world to refuse that offer. Because it was at such lucrative, whatever consideration, for Tata to come, particularly in terms of acquiring land. So, there is this constant process of pushing the boundaries in terms of incentivizing investment, and we need to look at these incentivization vis-a-vis the gains to ordinary people, because after all, it's this public exchequer which is meeting the cost of giving these incentives for investment. I'll skip, how this investment is concentrated only in few sectors. This is concentrated in few areas. So there is huge amount of unevenness in terms of spatial spread of this investment, in terms of this sectoral spread of this investment. Our manufacturing chapter elaborates this fairly exhaustively. More than 38% of the investment which is under implementation is in infrastructure projects. And it doesn't require any rocket scientists, Amarjeet was saying, to know that infrastructure projects are not immensely employment generated. They are by their very nature highly capital intensive. So this 38% investment is not sort of leading to great employment gains, which I will show later on when I look at the NSSO numbers, what has happened to employment, because massive sample size numbers of employment are most comprehensive if you want to look at employment across what I call the industrial classification, the NSSO classification. So we looked at that story later on. I'll skip the sub-regional story of manufacturing in Gujarat, but come to this, what explains this industrial investment. One I've already talked about, the combination of tax concessions, investments, subsidies, low interest credit, cheap or near zero cost of land, and overall, this race to the bottom, which brings its own business abuses. But one obvious fact that investment is often linked with is a friendly labor policy. We often talk about second generation labor reforms. So capital likes to go there where labor policy is more easy. But capital also knows its historical contradiction with labor. Right? It knows that capital doesn't accumulate without its sort of conflict of contradiction with labor. And Gujarat is a fascinating story. I don't say it. You can pick up India's economic survey. And there's a table in the economic survey, year after year, which gives data which is very inadequate, distorted, incomplete data on strikes and lockouts in Indian states, in the manufacturing sector. But it is as non-comprehensive for Gujarat as it is for Maharashtra, as it is for Tamil Nadu. So my logic once again remains that you can still look at it like that, and you will be surprised Gujarat has the maximum number of strikes and lockouts amongst all the Indian states. And this has been true for the last 300 years. Yet, Gujarat is attracting one of the highest investments in India. You need to ask, or at least I wanted to ask this question, that if labor policy or labor orientation is a great attraction for capital, then how does it explain Gujarat? My answer is this. You could disagree, or you could have your own answer. Gujarat is one state which promises a firm rule of law. I put this in quotation marks. Firm rule of law meaning that in a situation of conflict between capital and labor, it is very clear that this state will stand behind capital, not with labor. And it is this complete faith. So this construction of the authoritarian state in Gujarat comes to the rescue of the state, or comes to the advantage of the state. And I don't make this out of my out of thin air. There's literature in analyzing this in Gujarat, some interesting work done by Amarjeet and others, establishing how systematically the labor departments and labor policies in Gujarat have been constructed in a way that in spite of these strikes and lockouts, the decisions, the level of intervention is to the extent that you don't post whatever they are, when you go to these tribunals for hearings, so you don't post labor department people in these tribunals and make them defunct. So it starts at that level and it's much more systematic. So there's a clear message by the state that don't worry about the strikes and lockouts. Because if it happens in Bengal, the strike and lockout might go against you. But if it happens in Gujarat, it will go definitely in favor of you. So please feel secure, come to us, we'll take care of you. This is one plausible reason why, in spite of this obvious puzzle in terms of strikes and lockouts being so sharp in Gujarat, that the investment is so high. On infrastructure, it's just 2-3 minutes. It's a fascinating story. It's a fascinating story in the sense that this whole story of public transfer to private for profit, which is PPP. So this process of public, facilitating private profits, happens so systematically in Gujarat that 10 or 15 years down the lane, we will realize the kind of monopolies and consortiums we have created. We have few companies in Gujarat which own the foreign, which own the ports, which own the SEZs, which own the roads, which own the railways. So, few companies, say 2, 3, 4, I don't want to name them, they're available on websites, have access to, or privileged and exclusive access to all the foreign. See, Gujarat has the minor ports. Minor ports are, the story starts of privatization in Gujarat via ports. Gujarat has many, 19 minor ports, out of which it has focused on 7. Gujarat now carries 83% of the total cargo that goes through the minor ports. So it has become the #1 state, and it has developed these 7 minor ports. Once you develop these 7 minor ports, these are all private minor ports. Major ports, the power lies in the central government. Minor ports are completely in the jurisdiction of the state government. You create the ports, you create the SEZ. You have all the publicly funded big network of road. Private sector doesn't do anything, but you convert them into toll roads. So you transfer the existing public investment. So private sector doesn't come to build new roads. The access to the toll roads from the SEZ is done by the state government. So that where this SEZ should have made its own road to at least reach the highway, that investment is done by the state. But the highway is now under the BO model or the old model, so that the profits can be taken over by under the PPP scheme by the private sector. So it's interesting. We have looked at what is the orientation in terms of investment in road infrastructure in improving the access to human habitations. And what do we find? The Pradhan Mantri Sadak Yojana, Gramin Sadak Yojana, is the only investment which has improved the access of human habitations. As far as all expenditures by the state government is concerned, it is focused on improving the access of the SEZs, not human habitations. So clearly there is a systematic, well thought out strategy for the state to play a subservient role for corporate accumulation, for larger manufacturing accumulation. regulation, which gives, of course, brings high investment, brings high growth, and we are all very happy about the successful model of growth and investment in Gujarat. It's also interesting that the strategy of infrastructure development that the Gujarat state has adopted, it has focused on wherever the infrastructure existed. It's not in terms of developing greenfield sites. So in other words, it's not creating new additional infrastructure. It's only modifying and relocating or repositioning the existing infrastructure in this larger aspects of education. The Helga carried a very good piece by a friend of ours, who writes on infrastructure, of how this process happened. So, I mean, since I have not done any field-based work, so the field-based report in Helga, my book refers to that reference in Helga, of how this dynamics has happened. Now, what it has done? Very quickly, bullet points. I have looked at poverty, inequality, consumption, employment, health, education. 6 things. Within health, education, poverty, consumption, all possible indicators that you can think of. Mortality, morbidity, all of that. Simple principle, I have looked at ranking, how Gujarat has changed. You will be surprised at what is happening in poverty, what is happening in inequality, what is happening in health, what is happening in education. Gujarat has consistently slipped from its position in the 90s to its position now. No one is talking about it. We talk about nutrition. Modi said yes, it's about Gujarati women. They want to go slim. So it ended up into a very ridiculous conversation about nutrition in Gujarat. But forget nutrition, vaccinations. And again, as I said, I look at the social gap. I look at the gap between the Dalits and the non-Dalits in terms of access to government services. I look at the gap between men and women in terms of these indicators. For each of these indicators, the performance of Gujarat, surprising to me, I thought that at least I will get on one hand, on the other hand kind of story. Sometimes it's very social scientists like it. You say on one hand it has gained, but on the other hand it's lost. So that all of us remain puzzled. But in Gujarat's case, that it's unidirectional. Strangely enough, it is unidirectional. Did not give me the opportunity to talk about on one hand, on the other hand, but end up saying, well, it has not favored the ordinary people and the minority. Since time is running out, I will not talk about the numbers of inequality, poverty, consumption, employment, and the rest. If you have interest, I will only say that you will be shocked that there has been no, on NSSO data, there is no increase in aggregate employment in Gujarat. What has been the gain in the service sector has been compensated by the loss in the other sector. And if there are gains in employment in Gujarat, they are only in terms of casualization of the labor force. But then people tell me, Gujarat was never a state, sorry, I don't mean no regional bias intended, Gujarat was never a state which looked through education in terms of empowering itself. It always wanted to empower itself by investment because it's very essentially an entrepreneurial sort of community. And therefore, I shouldn't be too much bothered about the employment gains. But my story is that if you are looking at from the point of view of the poor and the marginalized, where public exchequer is subsidizing private education, I think it's fairly valid on our part, fairly legitimate and moral on our part to look at its implication on all the 6 outcomes that I'm talking about: consumption, inequality, poverty, employment, health and education, of how it has impacted the poor and the marginalized. And unfortunately, it hasn't benefited them positively. So I'll sum up and end the story here, and if there are questions, I'll share them with you. Thank you.
I've worked in one of the social science institute before coming here, and we have worked extensively in rural areas. So what I've seen is, mine was the 6th batch. So for the past 5 batches, what the students did in field work was go and interview and survey the local villagers and all. And for the 6 batches, they have got accurate, evident data, empirical data of what is the health, education scenario of that village. But those 70 villages in and around that district. But if we go through the case studies from the first batch to my batch, I couldn't see development happening in these areas, even though the institute did have empirical data. So unless and until you don't work on the data that we have collected, I don't know how much will it add up to the inclusive development that you were talking.
Can I ask a connected question? Yeah. Outcomes in nutrition, then you should actually also look at food security and then sanitation, water, public health, all of them. And then you talked about governance reforms are essential. So what kind of governance reforms do you think would be in line with achieving such a concerted action?
Well, the issue that widely raises is the issue of, it's not that field is not being visited. It is not that researchers are not trying to understand what is unfolding at the level of the field. But just that the evidence that we collect through this process, are we using that data to arrive at certain conclusions which can direct future work in public policy? I think it's a point of concern that here is an excellent example of the same villages being looked at over 6 years on similar parameters. So what it will throw up is extremely interesting data to understand if at all anything is changing. What is it that is changing and what needs to be worked on to make change in the right direction more effective. So clearly I think it's an agenda for universities like Azim, Premji, and especially the students here and to the faculty. I will surely appeal to them that some of this evidence-based work needs to come in the public domain more effectively. In fact, if the university could encourage the students, like what Atul was just mentioning, 10 of his students looking at various aspects of Gujarat, I think it's an excellent model of looking at, of course in this case it was secondary literature, a similar thing of visiting the field and maybe a series of evidence-based pieces on some of the human development challenges and issues as understood by students working in the field as per a particular framework. And if these evidence-based studies get published in the best of journals, the Economic Accounting Weekly and others, I think it will be very, very meaningful to take forward some of the discourse from pure ideology and opinions of individuals to actual public policy reshaping itself on account of the field work that is done. The issue of governance deficits, thank you for raising it. Frankly, when I was working on the book, a lot of critics said, what are you trying to argue? Will anybody even turn a page? You're talking about the state and its role. You're talking about how public policy and how human development, public systems have to provide for. This is the critique. Everybody has been in the receiving end of the public system. Somebody had to pay a bribe for a certificate, somebody did not get his license on time, something or the other happened. Now, why are you trying to make case for a public system that is already seen as having failed completely? And in fact, if at all, when you analyze what is it that goes wrong with public systems, I try to level best to detach myself from the system that I am a part of. But in spite of doing it, I still felt that there is no alternative. The tragedy is that for many of these sectors, education, health in particular, I think a lot of the point that Atul was making, how the development model which he has critiqued, it's a very new way of looking at issues on how many a time what we see as positive may well be a race to the bottom. And what are many factors? I think on the issue of governance deficit, very, very clearly, we have been what I always refer to as a regulatory state. The Indian state, the colonial state, which in many forms continued, was largely a regulatory state. A state for public order, a state for revenue collection, a state for relief, a state for many other possibilities. It was not a development state. We assigned to that state and its institutions development functions without adequately preparing them for it. So a whole series of governance reforms have to do even with the tasks that have to be carried out by the state. For example, if I just take the example of education, health, nutrition. Unfortunately, the same regulatory state, without changing its character much, was given the responsibility of doing development as well. There, naturally, if you were doing a good evidence-based study, you would have found that there are certain critical areas which were massive, massive gaps. There were many professional skills which were not available to these systems. There were many professionals who needed to be part of a system to be able to implement these programs were not there. The discontinuous leadership. So many of these issues. A country like Indonesia, which has done reasonably well on many of the human development parameters. Interestingly, you find that district teams which implement health, education and other programs have a tenure of 7 years in one district. The team works for 7 years and is held accountable for what it provides at the end of it. So when I talk about governance deficits, a lot of it has to do with the structure, a lot of it has to do with bringing in professionals into the system, a lot of it has also to do with transparency of the system in the eyes of the people. In the sense that normally what happens is the governance deficits in sectors like education and health have to do with lack of transparency in say procurements, have to do with lack of transparency in say transfer and postings, have to do with lack of transparencies in a whole lot of decision-making process within government systems. Now, if the regulatory state had to transform into a developmental one, while the RTI is a step in the right direction, because it makes a government explain its decisions, or at least share how that decision was taken. But then I also maintain that RTI is a big step forward. In many ways it is a post-mortem, after things have gone wrong. If you were to do it before things went wrong, you needed to recraft public systems differently. The example of managers, I was not saying it to please the students here. We've had the experience in the health sector where we tried systematically to bring in a lot of social science students from various institutions as health managers and hospital managers into the health system, from TISS Mumbai, from IHMR Jaipur, a whole lot of other institutions. The basic training of a manager from these institutions is problem solving. We need more people in the system who can solve problems. People with masters in computer applications, MCAs, for managing data systems, you need a whole lot of new skills into the system. Chartered accountants and cost accountants. The scale of the financial resources that we are dealing with, they can only be mismanaged by limited financial management systems, unless and until you also build in or craft new ways of management of financial systems. There are limits to what the system will be able to deliver. So the answer to your question, governance deficits inform all these aspects of systems of delivery, especially with regard to public services.
Listen to the type of development we are debating about, and it's very we are privileged to have a high-level bureaucrat and teacher and the contrasting type of development which is taking place in Gujarat, Bihar, and in South India to name a few. Like when I looked at the model which is there in Gujarat, it talks of something development which Americans or Western thinkers had. And in Bihar, it's like something like trickle-down economy. Still, we are persisting on, like, because when it comes to development as a whole of the state, then the chief minister goes to central to demand for something status where the development should be in such a way that it should be like funds should come from center. But both of you, if you analyze how it works in southern India, like in Tamil Nadu or Kerala, then what's your say on this, apart from writing it in a book, and how it works really in practical instance?
Look at state level outcomes. We have looked at state level outcomes across range of indicators and sectors. It's true that Tamil Nadu is doing exceedingly well. He was mentioning it, numbers show it. The question is, what do you attribute it to? The attribution becomes the complicated story. It is a result of what? Because on the face of it, I don't understand Tamil Nadu at all. I don't make any claim to understand Tamil Nadu. I'm only describing based on comparing states. That if you, on the face of it, if you look at the political process, it does not generate too much confidence. That the political process, political decision making is of the type which would lead to an outcome. So there has to be some strong institutional structures in place in Tamil Nadu which ensure that the same policy processes lead to better outcomes. My sense is it is not only about decentralized institutions, it has to be linked somehow with the history of political mobilization in Tamil Nadu and the political processes that have been placed in Tamil Nadu over the years, because
when you start evaluating Tamil Nadu vis-a-vis the differences between the OBC and Dalits, Tamil Nadu starts resembling the other states. I mean, so the dynamics of growth in Tamil Nadu and outcomes in Tamil Nadu start resembling the outcome experiences of other states when you look at the differences between, as I said, the Dalits and the OBC. But if you look at some other indicators, by and large, on averages and on social gap, you would find on gender and so on, that you would find Tamil Nadu doing a little better. But I really don't have any handle on what really is the reason that that's happening. It's definitely not about the rate of growth. So, I mean, for me, it is a matter of, it reinforces my argument that social outcomes cannot be achieved, and Amarjeet's whole argument was this, does not have one-to-one correspondence with the rates of growth, and if you add my second sort of smaller story with it, it's also about the nature of growth. Where growth comes from also influences the type of outcomes you get. So what is happening in Tamil Nadu, when one of my students is looking at 3 regions of Tamil Nadu and 3 different origins of capital, in the sense there are one part where the origin of capital is more agrarian, the other where there is international capital, and the third is the domestic manufacturing capital. And maybe the outcomes are related with the nature of capital as it is dispersed across regions in Tamil Nadu. I really don't know, I don't have an handle. But I also want to say a little bit about this debate on governance and outcomes. Because I wear another hat. I've been a member of the Governance Reforms Commission in Punjab for the last 6 years. So I've looked at governance. It's a very interesting time, and I was sharing it last night with my friends Vandana and Rupen yesterday night. It's a very interesting time. And just last week, the Ministry of Finance, Department of Economic Affairs, Government of India had called me to speak on governance. And so I had the 70 top officials, starting from the Finance Secretary, except the whole ministry, right up to all directors, wanting to know how they can improve governance in India. So I said it's a very interesting time that a social scientist has been asked to speak about governance. And you, bureaucrats, want to tell me about policy. Because you are so sure of what to do in policy making. All you want to learn from me is, okay, I'll set the boundaries of policy. Can you guys who know caste a little bit, who know gender a little bit, help me implement this policy? So, the whole discourse in governance is also inverted. Policy is a fix, one size fits all. It's the 4 components of policy making. Policy making has to respond to the context. But we are not living in a time where policy making will address the questions of the kind you are asking. Why Tamil Nadu is doing better? It's not about implementation. It's a wrong question to ask. That why? It's not a story only about implementation. It has to be much more organic to the process of growth and development in each region. But this is unfashionable. You don't ask the question because we know the solution. There is this free policy advice in circulation. Everyone knows what is to be done. The only problem is how to implement it. And so social scientists are now becoming members of governance commission to tell the bureaucrats how to implement it. The bureaucracy should know how to implement it, and they should discuss us the different options of policy making. But the state has abdicated its responsibility of owning responsibility for outcomes. You see, this is the politics and the political economy behind it. Once governance is given to me or to you guys, in the sense all of you guys who are helping the state implement its social sector policies by doing grassroots work, then 15 years, 20 years down the road, I and you are going to be responsible for failure on outcomes, not the state. State is providing you the money. State is also telling you what to do, but it is not telling you in a way that you can accuse them that you are telling you, because it just lays the broad parameters of policy. अब ये mission कर लो, दूसरा mission कर लो. Once the mission is set, then you guys are supposed to implement it. And then we also come in as social scientists and look at the little non-Dalit differences in Punjab and tell them what to do. How Dalits are losing out, how you can, So this is the whole dynamics is sort of this inversion of development strategy and policy that is happening. And I think we, at least sitting in university in this privileged position, need to ask these difficult questions so that we can disentangle this debate a little bit more.
And my little bit on Tamil Nadu situation. In my book, I have looked at Tamil Nadu very carefully. It's very interesting. I think 2 or 3 points I'd like to make by way of making those issues. The point about the political class which was just made. As part of my research for my previous book, India, Democracy and Well-being, I happened to look at all the public speeches of Naikar, the leader of the anti-Brahmin movement. Surprisingly, almost every public speech that he made, the first 2 lines were, "Women don't have too many children." that is going to be disempowering for you. Women, educate yourselves. Don't marry men. Coming from a political leader in each and every speech, one example. Now, given the fact what began as an anti-Brahmin movement very soon acquired the dimensions of a social movement. Of a social movement at the core of which was women as a constituency and education. If you analyze Tamil Nadu, interestingly, women as a constituency, whether it is DMK or ADMK, whichever party may come to power, women as a constituency is very significant in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu did not do land reforms like Kerala or West Bengal. Tamil Nadu has not done Panchayati Raj like Karnataka or West Bengal. But still, what is it that explains some of these gains? Women as a constituency is very important. A second illustration from the same state. The famous hot cooked meal program, noon meal program in Tamil Nadu. K. Kamaraj as Chief Minister. The first thing he does on becoming Chief Minister, summons the Chief Secretary that I want to provide food to the children. Please find out what it's going to cost. 2 hours later, the Chief Secretary walks to Kamaraj's room saying, "Sir, if you do that, the state will go bankrupt." The response of Kamaraj, "Mr. Chief Secretary, have you ever been to bed without food?" For a moment, he was a little natural. He said, "No, sir." He said, "I have, and I know what it is. Even if the state goes bankrupt, I will still do that." A point again about political leadership, trying to see, it began, Kamaraj also could not do it in the whole state because every Ramchandran was expanded into the whole state. But there lies an answer. The third issue, health. How come it is the only state which set up, not now, but decades ago, a public health cadre? You have civil surgeons and chief medical officers in other states. You have the deputy director, now the joint director, public health in Tamil Nadu in every district. The cadre is separate. When I joined as a doctor, I can either become a surgeon, physician, whatever, in the regular health hierarchy, or I can choose to join the public health cadre. If I join the public health cadre, within 5 years I have to necessarily acquire a postgraduate education in community medicine. Only if I have done community medicine can I become a district officer responsible for public health. Now this major policy decision taken so many decades ago has had very positive consequences because these public health leaders at the district level understand what is required on immunization and a whole lot of other requirements of the system. So there are many other examples, one could have gone on and on Tamil Nadu, but very interestingly, it did not do land reforms, it did not do Panchayati Raj. But still, it seems to have done better. Andhra and Tamil Nadu we keep comparing, just on private education as an example. In Andhra, we expanded private medical colleges. Tamil Nadu also expanded private medical colleges. What is the difference? Tamil Nadu simultaneously had a program of converting a district hospital into a government medical college every year. As a consequence, in Tamil Nadu, if I am looking for doctors for the public system, I will get doctors for the public system. In Andhra, we have created a generation of mercenaries. They have all paid a capitation of 80 lakhs to 1 crore to become an MBBS doctor. They don't want a 30,000 rupee a month government service. Distortions of public policy. And there were some people who in the 90s said higher education needs no public subsidy. If you didn't have subsidies for higher education, we would only have prepared mercenaries who would not have been available for public systems. So a lot of these debates need to be evidence-based rather than political. Sorry, I rushed to the other program. Thank you.
Slide 15 for you. Thank you very much, sir, for enlightening us on the background of the economic growth and all in Gujarat. So my question is with this only. What is the story behind poverty elevation program, which you have mentioned in the book also, of Government of India in Gujarat? As means the role, means the funds coming from the Government of India in the state of Gujarat, and what had been done in that domain in the last decade in Gujarat. Poverty elevation. Thank you.
Should I take one by one? Or if there are more questions?
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
elaborated it here.
Is it inevitable for other fast-growing industrial states to be going deep with the same project can be tracked in other states?
Sorry, two different questions, but let me take first your question. You have two sets of questions. I really don't know. I mean, I haven't done, looking at social movements in each state and its connect with the growth strategy and so on. So, in Gujarat, I've looked at a few things, but, not in the kind of detail that you were asked.
The three social camps you mentioned.
Yeah.
In that sense, the men versus women and
Right.
versus non-men versus.
Yeah.
In that terms, do you see the similar trajectory in other states?
In terms of outcome, by and large, yes. I mean, obviously, in some states there are differences because of the context in Tamil Nadu that you were talking about. But by and large, yes, because if the drivers of growth are going to be same. You see, you can achieve growth this way and that way. You can achieve 6% growth one way, you can also achieve 6% growth another way. But if it is going to be just corporate-led growth, with state constantly withdrawing itself, then the outcomes of growth are bound to be extremely uneven. I mean, Amarjeet's presentation facilitates this, point very easy, makes it very easy for me. Because unless state intervenes in a systematic manner, look at expenditures on education and health in Gujarat. So if Gujarat was 5th, now it is 10th. This systematic sliding down of its share on expenditure without other states. See, overall in India, social sector expenditure has got squeezed. So it is squeezed from Haryana, it is squeezed from Gujarat also. But whatever be the relative position, if you were third highest in the country in a particular year, now you are the 10th, amongst the 15 major states of India, then there is something that you are doing. Then we looked at in terms of who accesses public education. So the share of poor accessing public education or share of poor accessing public hospitals, that hasn't declined. Which means that if the public sector has declined, and if you believe the market logic to be true, the private sector should have come in its place to deliver and meet the needs of the people. After all, if there is demand, then the market should have responded. That's not happening. So the dependence of the poor on the public sector continues to be high, and now the public sector is not the same as it was, say, 95 or 98. So you have a much more smaller, poorer, less effective public sector in social, in education and health, to which the last section of poor continues to live. So therefore I am saying that unless, it's not only about the rates of growth, it's about the characteristics of growth. Where does the growth come from? If the drivers of growth across the states are going to be of a similar kind, as has been the case in Gujarat, then perhaps the outcome are going to be of similar kind. Because I say this with relative confidence, because it's very consistent across indicators. As I was saying earlier, if it was a big mixed story, then perhaps there could have been a question mark. So that is one answer to the larger issue of outcomes will be similar, by and large, yes, unless
maybe one point that rule of law is important, the sense of authoritarian notion, which may be different from other states other than Gujarat.
So how would that impact social outcomes differently?
You talked about
but that's my sense. I mean, in the sense that I gave the example in the context of investment. Investment is so high. See, Gujarat is number 1 in investment. It's, depending on which indicator you take, it's 3rd or 7th in employment. So, it keeps going its share of investment. So more and more capital is willing to go there. First of all, it's more capital intensive, so it's not too much worried about the labor. But if to the extent it is worried about the labor, the state comes as a protector of capital's interest. So, you can't mess with it, so to say. If you mess with it, the state will intervene. And state will intervene on the behalf of capital. That's my sense. I mean, there could be more reasons than that. Maybe it's, to do with the ease of investment in the sense that, as is being normally talked about, that the bureaucracy has become friendlier to investor. So they say one window clearance, they have these, things. I don't think that's the substantial story. Because capital goes into the remotest parts of the world where it's very difficult to go if the profits are to be made. So finally, I think capital doesn't go about good governance, bad governance, face of the chief minister, political ideology. Ultimately, where the profits are to be made best is what attracts investment. I think that's the fundamental principle that matters to capital. And we have to see how Gujarat fits in that case. On the question of poverty, to be honest, I have not looked at the performance of the social programs of the government and compared Gujarat with the other states. I haven't, the book doesn't look at it. Yes, we have looked at the outcome of poverty. This is what has happened in the numbers of poverty. And again, I mean, I can give you the exact numbers, I don't remember them. But you know, rural poverty and urban poverty is very disturbing what we find in Gujarat. Really. That, you know, in spite of this high growth, why that has happened, I really don't know. I mean, in a sense, it should have done much better. I'll share some numbers with you just to tell you what has happened on poverty. Gujarat is better than the national average. So if you are this is the story of averages. So if you compare the average poverty in Gujarat with the average poverty in India, Gujarat is doing better. But this is no new insight. I mean, it was better even before. So you have to look at changes in poverty, how poverty has declined or increased. Decline in urban poverty in Gujarat has been very, very slow in the last 5 years. This is the year in which huge investment has come in Gujarat. And the decline of poverty in urban Gujarat is the slowest. It has to do with the nature of employment or lack of employment it is generating and the casualization of employment that is happening in the urban areas in Gujarat. In rural poverty, Gujarat's relative performance is better than its urban poverty and it's better than the national average. But if you start comparing Gujarat with relatively faster growing states, say Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Haryana, surprisingly Gujarat does not come out as better states. It's actually lower down in the order. On inequality, which is related to the same consumption data, inequality in Gujarat is very high. And in early 90s, Gujarat was much better ranked in terms of its relative position on inequality compared to 2009-10. Because the NSS surveys towards the 2009-10, so that's where I can compare. So if you compare 93-94 NSS around with 2009-10 NSS around, the relative rank of Gujarat has worsened on inequality. Now, this has to be explained because Gujarat has done, it's a relatively balanced growth, but there is a failure of this growth in terms of its outcome. And perhaps you may have a better explanation of why it has failed. My sense is that it is based on the nature of growth strategy that Gujarat has adopted. Now, this is not the only story, but there will be other reasons than this. But those will be more micro reasons that can only be drawn out from field-based studies, which I haven't done. So I really don't know how Gujarat performs in terms of uptake from the central government. But you want to know, does it use PDS? How does it use its PDS with other states? Really, I haven't carefully looked at it to tell you anything about that.
When you entered the session saying that there's no net employment gain, when you say there's no, have you included the contract laborers, casual laborers?
Yes. Yeah, the National Sample Survey first looks at aggregate employment. Then it classifies employment on 3 bases. So, there are 3, there is what is called the principal status, current daily status and current weekly status. So without going into the technical details, yes, it covers the nature, whether it's contract, casual, regular, whatever. Principal occupation, subsidiary occupation. This is the net sum total of employment gains or losses. And I was talking about particularly the period between 2004-05, which is the 61st round, and 2009-10, which is the 66th round. So if you compare these 5 periods, because you see, this is a period of hype, Gujarat, growth, all of that. So it should reflect in something in terms of employment. So it doesn't. Now don't ask me, a lot of people have asked me when I say this, then why do people support this this growth model if people have not gained? I don't know. You have to look at how people formulate opinions, how hegemonic ideas get established, the complexities of ideology and perceptions. I don't know. But it is factually correct based on the necessary data that Gujarat has not gained at all in employment in between 2004-05 and 9-10. If you look at 93-94, 98-99 and 4-5, yes, there have been some increase in employment in Gujarat, but not in the last 5 to 6 years. So I've looked at contract and everything else, clearly. And if you look at our employment tables in the book, you'll find the tables. There are detailed appendix of tables which gives all the detailed information on This is based on unit record, which means household level data collected through, which is, we are looking at about 8 lakh households. And you are using this information from 8 lakh households in the rural areas to call out that information at the state level. So it's fairly sort of detailed data that is available. And I feel fairly confident of this data in terms of its overall contribution.
Atul, when you were talking about the scopes, that is,
Growth.
we talked about growth in primary sector. I was wondering if your students or you have looked at irrigation, in the story of irrigation at Gujarat, because I believe that Gujarat is also much talked about of having one big irrigation, and there it's not merely the state exchequers capture. There is a lot of indiscriminate market borrowing that went on starting from 93. There is a lot of accelerated irrigation benefit program, central government program.
Right.
Gujarat in that particular project has been the largest beneficiary.
Exactly.
If you get, and what has that project delivered? If you look at the story of the,
we have looked at the aggregate numbers of investment in irrigation. We haven't looked at the big project and its implication. But as I said, there have been no increases in irrigation in the regions in which these high value-added crops are growing, which are the drivers of growth in irrigation. So particularly that means that investment is, irrigation is not the core impetus for growth in agriculture output, which is the source of growth of agriculture in Gujarat. That much I can say. How it has unfolded in other areas, as I said, we haven't done a field-based study. And I have the article on agriculture is fairly exhaustive. And people who have written it actually have some insights at the field level. But we have consciously avoided giving any inputs on the field-based study. Because field-based study really is my word versus your word. Unless you really do a very comprehensive field-based study, right? So I pick up, it's like a BBC correspondent picking up someone in Jamnagar and then saying, oh, petrochemical industry has done wonders, and then picking up someone in Surat, and then, so, we haven't done that kind of analysis at all. So, but you're right, investment, it's the central government funded investment projects which have given benefits to India. Absolutely. But I haven't looked at, that part, Narmada and the other stuff. Shall we? Thank you very much for being so patient.